At 06:32 hours on the morning of March 6, 1943, a British gunner crouched in a shallow scrape 800 yards east of Medan in Tunisia watched through the dust as a German Panzer III materialized from the haze. The tank commander's head was visible in the open cupola, scanning for threats. The gunner's hand tightened on the firing lever of his 6-pounder anti-tank gun. Behind him, stretched across 5 miles of Tunisian scrubland, 469 other guns waited in absolute silence. Every weapon dug in, camouflaged, pre-zeroed on landmarks the crews had memorized over 3 days of preparation. The Panzer rolled closer. 600 yards, 500, 400. The gunner did not fire. 3 Panzer divisions were driving straight into the trap. 162 tanks, spread across 4 converging columns, advancing through morning fog toward positions they believed the British were still organizing. No warning had reached them. No reconnaissance had spotted what waited ahead. The 1st Panzer III crossed an invisible line at 06:32, and the gunners squeezed the firing lever. The 6-pounder cracked once. The armor-piercing round punched through the Panzer's hull at a range of 370 yards. The tank brewed up instantly, turret hatches blown open by internal explosions, black smoke pouring into the cold desert air. The crew never got out. Then the desert erupted. 21 minutes later, 6 German tanks were burning. The Panzers could not see what was killing them. Muzzle flashes appeared from positions that should have been empty, from scrapes invisible against the desert floor, from gun pits dug so deep only the barrel protruded above ground level. German tank commanders traversed their turrets, fired at suspected positions, hit nothing but sand and rock. The British guns fired 3 rounds per minute, methodical, disciplined, devastating. Every round found steel. By 0700 hours, the lead elements of the 10th Panzer Division had stopped advancing and started dying. Over the next 11 hours, the British 8th Army destroyed 52 German tanks at Medellin. Erwin Rommel threw 3 Panzer divisions against prepared positions and lost a third of his armor in a single day. The 8th Army suffered 130 casualties. They did not lose a single tank because Bernard Montgomery never committed any. 470 anti-tank guns, 350 field artillery pieces, 400 tanks held in reserve, 70,000 mines, and 72 hours of advance warning from ultra code breakers at Bletchley Park. The Desert Fox had walked into an ambush designed specifically to kill him. It was not a battle. It was an execution. This is the story of how 500 guns waited in silence for the man who had terrorized the British Army for 2 years. How ultra-intelligence gave Montgomery the enemy's battle plan before Rommel's own field commanders received it. How the lesson learned at Outpost Snipe, where 19 guns destroyed 52 Panzers 5 months earlier, was applied at industrial scale across 5 miles of killing ground. How Rommel's last offensive in Africa ended before the sun went down on the day it began. And how 3 days later, the Desert Fox climbed into a Fieseler Storch and flew out of Africa forever, leaving 230,000 soldiers behind to face the inevitable collapse he had predicted and no one had believed. I spent 9 hours writing, editing, and researching this story, paying attention to every detail to honor the soldiers who fought at Medellin. If this story matters to you, the only thing I ask is that you do 2 things. First, subscribe to the channel. Second, drop a comment right now telling us what city you are watching from. Are you in Berlin, London, Cairo, New York? Our community is worldwide, and knowing where you are helps us understand who is keeping these stories alive. Just write your city, that is all. Thank you. To understand why Medellin destroyed Rommel, you need to understand what happened 5 months earlier at a place called Outpost Snipe. October 27th, 1942, the Second Battle of El Alamein. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner and the 2nd Battalion Rifle Brigade, 300 men with 19 6-pounder anti-tank guns, occupied a depression in the desert 900 yards behind their intended objective, deep behind German lines, surrounded by the largest concentration of Axis armor at El Alamein. Dawn revealed their mistake. German and Italian tanks, dozens of them, refueling in a lager 800 yards to the west. The British gunners could see fuel trucks, maintenance crews, tank commanders drinking coffee in open cupolas. Turner had 2 choices. Withdraw across open desert in daylight under direct observation, or stay silent and hope the panzers moved away. The tanks came straight toward Snipe. The first engagement happened at dawn when German tanks exposed their side armor. The gunners opened fire. Smoke and explosions obscured the position as German artillery replied. When smoke cleared, 6 German tanks, 8 Italian tanks, and 2 self-propelled guns were burning. 3 British 6-pounders were knocked out. The rest remained operational. The panzers regrouped and attacked again. Erwin Rommel could see the fighting from his headquarters. He assembled approximately 70 Axis tanks and self-propelled guns in 2 waves, 1,200 yards west of outpost Snipe, preparing to attack after bombardment and Stuka dive bomber strike. The Stukas never reached their target. American P-40 Warhawks intercepted them. Royal Air Force Hurricanes finished what the Americans started. The ground attack proceeded without air support. The panzers advanced. British gunners waited until tanks closed to 200 yards before firing. Turrets blew off, hulls exploded, ammunition cooked off inside burning vehicles. A sergeant named Calistan crawled to an unmanned gun with only 30 armor-piercing rounds remaining. 3 German tanks closed to point-blank range, machine guns firing. Calistan hit the lead tank twice. The second round penetrated. He knocked out the next 2 tanks through the wreckage of the first. All 3 panzers died within 100 yards of his gun. By late afternoon, the men of outpost Snipe had been under continuous fire for 14 hours. 13 6-pounders remained operational, but ammunition was running low. German artillery had zeroed their position. Axis tanks surrounded them on 3 sides. Lieutenant Colonel Turner, wounded in the head by shrapnel, joined a gun crew as loader and helped destroy 5 more panzers before allowing treatment. At 18:44 hours, Turner signaled withdrawal. As darkness fell, survivors walked 2.5 miles under fire back to British lines, dragging their wounded. 1 month later, an official investigation counted 52 to 57 Axis armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. 37 wrecks still littered the field. The 2nd Rifle Brigade had suffered 72 casualties, but had destroyed roughly 10% of Rommel's total armored strength at El Alamein. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Turner was awarded the Victoria Cross. Here is what Bernard Montgomery learned from outpost Snipe. Properly positioned anti-tank guns, dug in, camouflaged, pre-zeroed on landmarks, supported by artillery and protected by infantry, could gut an armored assault. 19 guns destroyed 52 panzers. The doctrine was proven. The question was whether it could scale from a battalion-sized action to an army-level operation, whether the lesson of Snipe could be applied across miles instead of yards. The answer arrived in Tunisia 5 months later, when ultra-codebreakers at Bletchley Park handed Montgomery an envelope containing the details of Rommel's next attack before Rommel's own commanders knew the plan existed. February 25th, 1943. The decrypt was specific. Operation Capri, attack on Medellin. 3 panzer divisions, axis of advance northwest to southeast, objective to disrupt 8th Army preparations for assault on Mareth Line. Montgomery had 72 hours. By late February 1943, Erwin Rommel was caught between 2 armies. Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east after the long pursuit from El Alamein. Dwight Eisenhower's forces pushing from the west following Operation Torch. Tunisia was the last Axis territory on the continent, and it was shrinking daily. Every tank destroyed, every truck burned, every experienced crew killed or captured, gone permanently. The Allies shipped fresh equipment across the Atlantic faster than the Africa Corps could count losses. German and Italian supply ships tried to cross the Mediterranean and were intercepted by ultra-directed submarines and aircraft. The numbers did not work. Rommel understood it. His superiors in Berlin and Rome chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable arithmetic. Operation Capri was Rommel's last card, a spoiling attack. Hit Montgomery before the 8th Army was ready to assault the Mareth Line, shatter the forward positions, inflict casualties, buy time. It was vintage Rommel doctrine: speed, aggression, shock action, decisive maneuver. The approach had worked at Gazala in June 1942, when Rommel destroyed 350 British tanks. It had worked at Kasserine Pass 2 weeks earlier. But the British were no longer the same army Rommel had faced in 1941. They had learned. By March 1943, the British Eighth Army had refined a doctrine: let the guns kill the tanks, hold the armor in reserve, prepare the battlefield in depth, use intelligence to predict enemy movements, and wait for the panzers to drive into pre-planned killing zones. The terrain made it possible. Medellin sat at the base of the Matmata Hills, rocky high ground to the west, forming the inland flank of the Mareth line. Between the hills and the coast, a narrow strip of desert funneled any attacking force into predictable corridors. If you were commanding a panzer division ordered to attack Medellin, every route forward led through a bottleneck. Montgomery received the first Ultra Decrypt on February 25th. A second decrypt on February 28th provided operational details, attack window opening March 4th through 6th. The intelligence was so specific that Montgomery knew Rommel's intentions before some of Rommel's divisional commanders received their orders. On February 26th, the Eighth Army had approximately 1 division at Medellin. Most of its armor was at Benghazi, 1,000 miles away. Rommel would attack on March 6th. Montgomery had 72 hours to transform a lightly held assembly area into a fortress. What followed was an engineering miracle executed under combat pressure. Artillery forward observation officers walked every meter of ground between Medellin and the Matmata Hills, mapping every fold, every depression, every natural approach route a tank might use. They assigned coordinates to landmarks, trees, rocks, distinctive terrain features. Every 6-pounder crew received a sketch map showing their field of fire and the pre-zeroed coordinates for likely target locations. The gunners memorized these positions during daylight, then dug their pits deeper under cover of darkness. The digging went on for 3 days and nights. Gun pits 8 feet deep, narrow at the top to minimize signature, wide at the bottom for crew room. Camouflage nets woven with desert scrub. Dummy positions 50 yards away to draw fire. Each gun had primary and fallback positions pre-prepared. Ammunition stacked within arm's reach. Range cards taped to gun shields. The 6-pounder crews knew every meter of their killing ground. Behind the anti-tank guns, field artillery dug in. 25-pounders positioned for indirect fire. Forward observers with radios in hides where they could see the battlefield and call fire missions. Behind the artillery, infantry occupied strongpoints. And behind everything, 400 tanks of X-Corps waited in reserve. Engines cold, crews resting. Montgomery had no intention of committing his armor unless the gun line failed. The guns were the killing mechanism. The tanks were the insurance policy. By the evening of March 5th, the Eighth Army was ready. 470 anti-tank guns covered 5 miles of front. 350 field artillery pieces zeroed on pre-planned targets. 70,000 mines laid in belts. 400 tanks in reserve. And 72 hours of preparation guided by intelligence so precise that Montgomery knew where Rommel would attack, when he would attack, and with what forces. The Eighth Army had weaponized terrain itself. Every fold in the ground, every depression, every piece of cover a tank crew might use, the British had mapped it, measured it, and pointed a gun at it. The panzers were not fighting an army. They were fighting terrain that had been turned into a killing ground. Let that detail sit for a moment. The Germans were attacking a position designed specifically to kill them. Every logical piece of cover, every approach route, the British had pre-zeroed guns on it. The panzers were fighting ground that killed by mathematical inevitability rather than chance. At 07:14 hours on March 6th, the 15th Panzer Division's war diary records a request from the division commander for permission to withdraw. The request was denied. Rommel, monitoring from a command post in the rear, ordered a second assault. The operational concept remained sound, he believed. Concentrated armor, properly supported, could achieve penetration. But proper support did not exist. The Luftwaffe could not establish air superiority. German artillery was outranged and outnumbered, and the panzers were advancing into a killing zone, prepared specifically to destroy them. The second wave came at 0800 hours. It fared worse than the first. British gunners had found their rhythm. Targets appeared, ranges were called, guns fired, tanks died. The process became mechanical. A trained 6-pounder crew could sustain 3 aimed shots per minute. The panzers were silhouettes against the morning sky, advancing into the rising sun. German crews were partially blinded by glare. British gunners had clear targets backlit by dawn. An officer with the 2nd Royal Horse Artillery described it later as target practice with incoming fire. The incoming fire hit almost nothing. German tank guns fired at suspected positions, at muzzle flashes, at anything that might represent a threat. Most rounds went high or wide. The guns were too well concealed. At Tadjera Ridge, a group of panzers found what appeared to be a gap and pushed through. They found the Scots Guards waiting with 6-pounders, pre-laid on the exact route the panzers had taken. One Panzer IV closed to 200 yards. The round penetrated the turret ring, and the turret blew clean off, tumbling through the air before crashing 30 yards behind the burning hull. The 21st Panzer Division, attacking from the south, made the deepest penetration of the day, nearly 2 kilometers into British lines. For an hour, it looked like the breakthrough Rommel needed, but the farther the panzers advanced, the more exposed their flanks became. They had pushed past the first gun line straight into the second. The British had prepared defense in depth. Breaking through one position just meant entering the kill zone of the next. Fresh batteries that had not fired all morning opened on the penetrating column. The panzers were surrounded by guns they had not known existed. The penetration stalled, then collapsed. Around 1000 hours, the Luftwaffe tried to intervene. Junkers Ju-87 Stukas appeared over the battlefield. British troops stood up in their slit trenches and cheered. A squadron of Spitfires had dropped out of the sun onto the Stukas' tails. The dive bombers scattered. Some jettisoned bombs early. Others pulled out and fled north. The Desert Air Force had twice as many aircraft as the Axis. German and Italian air support died in the sky before it could influence the battle. Rommel ordered a third push at 10:15 hours. This attack barely made it within 800 yards before breaking apart. The surviving panzers reversed through smoke and dust, crews half blind. The shooting sputtered out around 1100 hours. The field in front of the British positions looked like a scrapyard. Burned-out hulks scattered across the scrubland. Oil fires sent black columns into the sky. The British gun crews sat beside their weapons and waited for orders. The numbers came in over the following hours. 52 German tanks destroyed. Not damaged, not disabled. Destroyed, burned, penetrated, turrets blown off, crews killed. The exact same number the 2nd Rifle Brigade had claimed at Outpost Snipe 5 months earlier. But this time it happened in a single morning with almost no British casualties. The 8th Army's losses for the entire engagement: 130 men killed and wounded, 1 anti-tank gun destroyed. No tanks lost because Montgomery had not committed any. The doctrine worked. The guns did the job. The tanks stayed hidden. The Germans lost over 600 men, veterans who had survived Tobruk, Gazala, the long retreat across Egypt, killed in a charge against a position that was waiting for them. 52 tanks, 600 men, 1 morning, and the Afrika Korps was finished as an offensive force forever. We will be right back with part 2, where you will hear how Rommel knew immediately what Medellin meant, how he reported the truth to Berlin and was ignored, how 3 days later he climbed into a Fieseler Storch and flew out of Africa never to return, and how the 230,000 soldiers he left behind had exactly 67 days until the largest Axis surrender outside Stalingrad. Do not go anywhere. Erwin Rommel stood at his command post east of Medellin and watched the dust settle over his destroyed panzers. It was 11:30 hours on March 6, 1943. The shooting had stopped. The silence felt heavier than the artillery barrage that preceded it. 52 tanks burning, 600 men gone. The attack had lasted 5 hours from first contact to final withdrawal. The Afrika Korps, as an offensive striking force, had lasted exactly that long. 5 hours. Then it was over. Rommel understood immediately what most of his staff would take days to accept. This was not a tactical setback that could be retaken with better preparation. This was mathematical proof that the Afrika Korps no longer possessed the strength to attack fortified positions held by an enemy with material superiority, air superiority, intelligence superiority, and 3 days to prepare. The equation did not balance. It would never balance again. The war in North Africa was lost. Everything that followed would be delay, not victory. At 1300 hours, Rommel dictated a message to Rome and Berlin. The text was blunt. The attack at Medellin had failed with heavy losses. British defensive positions far stronger than reconnaissance indicated. Enemy had advanced knowledge of the offensive. Recommend immediate evacuation of all Axis forces from Tunisia while coherent withdrawal is still possible. Current supply situation makes sustained defense untenable. Estimated time before collapse, 60 to 90 days maximum. The response came back within hours. Continue operations. Hold current positions. Reinforcements and supplies en route. The Führer has complete confidence in your ability to stabilize the situation. Rommel read the message twice, then filed it without comment. There would be no reinforcements. The supplies would not arrive in quantities that mattered. Hitler's confidence was irrelevant to mathematics. You cannot hold ground without fuel, ammunition, food, and replacement soldiers. The Afrika Korps had none of those things in sufficient quantity. The end was visible now, close enough to count in weeks. Subscribe to this channel right now because what you're about to hear is how Rommel reported the truth and was punished for honesty, how the man who had been Germany's most celebrated general flew out of Africa 3 days later and never returned, how 230,000 soldiers were left behind to fight a battle their commander knew they could not win, and why the largest Axis surrender outside Stalingrad happened exactly 67 days after Medellin proved the war was already over. Do not miss this. Rommel's relationship with Berlin had been deteriorating for months. Since El Alamein, he had sent increasingly urgent reports describing reality on the ground: fuel shortages, ammunition shortages, Allied air superiority making daylight movements suicidal, the impossibility of receiving adequate replacements. The reports were filed, acknowledged, and ignored. Hitler did not want reality. He wanted North Africa held regardless of cost, regardless of feasibility, because abandoning Africa meant acknowledging that Germany was losing the war. Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent 2 years building Rommel into a mythical figure, the Desert Fox, the unbeatable panzer general who had humiliated the British from Tobruk to Gazala. German newspapers ran stories about tactical genius. Newsreels showed panzers racing across desert under brilliant command. The German public believed the Afrika Korps was winning. Rommel knew better. He had known since November 1942 that North Africa was lost. Medellin simply made it undeniable. The problem was not generalship. The problem was arithmetic. The British could replace every tank they lost. The Germans could not. British fuel depots stretched back hundreds of miles. German fuel came across the Mediterranean by ship, and Allied aircraft and submarines were sinking those ships faster than they could be replaced. British soldiers ate hot meals. German soldiers went hungry because food convoys never arrived. You cannot win a war of attrition when your enemy can replace losses, and you cannot. Rommel had been screaming this reality at Berlin for months. Berlin had responded by promoting him to field marshal and ordering him to keep fighting. On March 9th, 3 days after Medellin, Rommel received new orders. Report to Führer headquarters immediately for consultation. Leave command of Army Group Africa to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Rommel understood what the orders meant. He was being recalled because he had told the truth too loudly, because his reports contradicted the narrative Berlin wanted to maintain. They were removing him not because he had lost battles, but because he had won too many, and could not be blamed for the inevitable collapse. At 0800 hours on March 9th, Rommel walked through his headquarters for the last time. He spoke briefly with his staff officers. Most conversations lasted less than a minute. There was nothing left to say. He shook hands with von Arnim, the man inheriting command of an army group that existed mostly on paper. Von Arnim had been told he would receive reinforcements, supplies, air support. Rommel did not correct the lie. Von Arnim would learn the truth soon enough. A Fieseler Storch waited at the airstrip outside Sfax. The pilot had engines running. Rommel climbed into the rear seat with a single leather case containing his personal effects. He did not look back as the plane lifted off and turned north towards Sicily. Below him, stretched across hundreds of miles of Tunisian desert, 230,000 German and Italian soldiers continued fighting. They did not know their commander had left. They did not know Berlin had already written them off. They believed reinforcements were coming, that supplies would arrive, that the situation would stabilize. None of it was true. Rommel landed in Rome that afternoon. He met with Mussolini and Comando Supremo. He repeated the same assessments he had been sending for months. Tunisia is untenable. Evacuation is the only rational option. Every week of delay costs lives with no strategic benefit. Mussolini listened politely and promised to relay Rommel's concerns to Hitler. The meeting ended after 30 minutes. Nothing changed. Rommel flew to Germany the next morning. He would never return to North Africa. He would never command troops in combat again until the desperate days of Normandy 15 months later, when he would face the same impossible arithmetic against an enemy with even greater material superiority. The soldiers Rommel left behind kept fighting because soldiers do what they are ordered to do. Von Arnim assumed command. He issued optimistic assessments to Berlin describing defensive positions, planned counterattacks, troop morale. The assessments were fiction. British and American forces were tightening the noose around Tunisia. Every supply convoy sunk in the Mediterranean reduced German combat effectiveness. Every day of air superiority allowed Allied aircraft to attack with impunity. The Afrika Korps was not fighting a war anymore. It was dying by degrees, burning through last reserves while waiting for help that would never arrive. On March 20th, 14 days after Medellin, Montgomery launched Operation Pugilist against the Mareth Line. The assault initially stalled against prepared German positions. Montgomery responded by sending the New Zealand Division on a flanking maneuver through the Tobaga Gap. German forces shifted to block it. The shift created a gap at Mareth. British armor poured through. The line collapsed. By March 28th, the 8th Army had broken through and the Afrika Korps was retreating north toward the final defensive perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte. American forces attacking from the west were pushing east with increasing effectiveness. The Axis forces were being compressed into a shrinking pocket. Tunisia became a killing ground where German and Italian soldiers fought, knowing there was no escape. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. The Regia Marina could not protect convoys. Every transport ship attempting the crossing from Sicily risked being sunk. Some ships made it through. Most did not. Soldiers in Tunisia watched skies for supply drops that rarely came. Rationed ammunition to 3 rounds per rifle, ate whatever could be scavenged. There are accounts from German soldiers describing the surreal disconnect between propaganda broadcasts from Berlin and the reality they faced. Radio Berlin announced great victories, strategic withdrawals to better positions, imminent reinforcements. The soldiers in Tunisia knew it was lies. They could see Allied aircraft overhead. They could count the empty fuel drums. They could feel the hunger. But orders from Berlin were clear: hold at all costs, no retreat, reinforcements coming soon. So they held, and they died. By late April, the Axis defensive perimeter had been compressed to a pocket roughly 50 miles across, centered on Tunis and Bizerte. 250,000 soldiers trapped in an area smaller than some counties in England, surrounded by Allied forces that outnumbered them 3 to 1, with no air support, dwindling ammunition, and starvation rations. Von Arnim sent increasingly desperate messages to Berlin. Situation critical. Ammunition exhausted. No fuel for tactical movement. Request permission to negotiate surrender terms. The responses from Berlin were variations of the same order. Resist to the last man. No surrender authorized. The Führer expects every soldier to do his duty. Hitler's logic was not military. It was theatrical. Every week the Afrika Korps held Tunisia was another week Germany was not visibly losing the war. The soldiers dying in North Africa were props in a propaganda performance designed to convince the German public that victory was still possible. The lives of 230,000 men mattered less than maintaining the illusion of strength. Berlin knew the Afrika Korps was doomed. They had known since Rommel's first reports after El Alamein. They ordered those men to fight and die anyway, because the alternative was admitting defeat, and the Nazi regime could not survive admissions of defeat. On May 7th, British tanks entered Tunis from the south. American forces entered Bizerte from the northwest. The Axis defensive perimeter collapsed. German and Italian units tried to withdraw, but there was nowhere to withdraw to. The Mediterranean was behind them, controlled by Allied naval forces. Surrender was forbidden. Escape was impossible. Thousands of soldiers simply stopped fighting, laid down their weapons, and waited for capture. Some units resisted for another day or two out of discipline or desperation. It made no difference. On May 12, 1943, General von Arnim surrendered. 230,000 Axis soldiers marched into captivity. It was the largest German surrender of the war outside Stalingrad. 67 days after Medellin, exactly the time frame Rommel had predicted in his March 6th message to Berlin. The message that had been ignored. The truth that had been too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The arithmetic that did not care about Hitler's confidence, or Goebbels' propaganda, or the Desert Fox's reputation. Drop a comment right now telling us what city you are watching from, and what you think about the fact that Rommel predicted the exact timeline of collapse and was removed from command for telling the truth. Are you in Paris, Houston, Mumbai? Our community is global and we want to know you are there. Just your city. Thank you. The cost of that denial was 230,000 prisoners. How many of those men could have been evacuated if Berlin had authorized withdrawal in March? How many lives were spent maintaining an illusion that fooled nobody except the people who needed to believe it most? The numbers do not lie. The Africa Corps could have been saved. Berlin chose propaganda over soldiers. Rommel spent the next 15 months in Germany. He was too valuable as a propaganda symbol to be discarded entirely, too dangerous as a truth-teller to be trusted with significant command. Hitler assigned him to inspect the Atlantic Wall defenses in France. Rommel toured bunkers, interviewed garrison commanders, and filed reports describing the same problems he had identified in North Africa. Insufficient resources, inadequate preparation, unrealistic expectations. The reports were filed and ignored. History was repeating itself on a larger scale. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed at Normandy. Rommel was in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday. He rushed back to France and assumed command of defensive operations. For 6 weeks, he attempted to contain the Allied breakout using depleted divisions, insufficient armor, and crumbling logistics. The arithmetic that had doomed the Africa Corps was destroying Army Group B. Rommel could see it happening again. Material superiority, air superiority, intelligence superiority. The Allies could replace losses. Germany could not. The equation did not balance. On July 17, 1944, British fighters strafed Rommel's staff car on a road near Sainte-Foy de Montgomery. The car crashed. Rommel suffered a fractured skull. He was evacuated to a hospital in Germany. 3 days later, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at the Wolf's Lair. The plot failed. Hitler survived. The Gestapo began investigating everyone who might have known about the conspiracy. Rommel's name appeared in the interrogation transcripts, not as an active conspirator, but as someone the plotters believed might support a post-Hitler government. That was enough. On October 14, 1944, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They gave him a choice: face trial for treason, which would result in execution and disgrace for his family, or take poison, receive a state funeral, and allow his family to keep their pension and honors. Rommel chose the poison. He died in the back seat of a car 20 minutes later. The official announcement described a cerebral embolism resulting from injuries sustained in the air attack. The state funeral followed. Hitler sent a wreath. Here is the legacy of Medellin, not the battle itself, which was tactically significant but strategically inevitable. The legacy is what happens when truth becomes inconvenient to power. Rommel told Berlin the truth about North Africa. He was removed from command. The soldiers he left behind died maintaining an illusion. Rommel told the truth again about Normandy. He was implicated in a conspiracy, forced to commit suicide, and given a hero's funeral to maintain a different illusion. The pattern is consistent. Truth was subordinate to narrative. Lives were subordinate to propaganda. Reality was subordinate to ideology. 52 tanks destroyed at Medellin, 600 men killed, 230,000 surrendered 67 days later. And the man who predicted all of it was forced to drink poison because he could not stop telling the truth. That is the real story of the ambush that ended Rommel forever. Not the guns, not the tactics. The collision between arithmetic and ideology. Mathematics won, it always does. But the men who understood the mathematics rarely survived the men who refused to believe it. Subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. These stories matter because they show us what happens when institutions value comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. When propaganda matters more than reality. When maintaining illusions costs more than acknowledging failures. The lesson of Medellin is not about anti-tank guns or ultra-intelligence or desert warfare. The lesson is about what happens when the people in charge refuse to listen to the people who know. 52 tanks, 67 days, 230,000 prisoners, and one field marshal dead in the back seat of a car because he could not stop doing the math. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next foxhole.